Hello, today is Monday, the 30th of September 24, and I just finished a chapter which was by Dennis Kelsey, chapter 8, entitled Parenthood. This book, Many Lifetimes, is a collaboration between Joan Marshall Grant and her husband, Dennis Kelsey. She passed away in 1989. I don't know whether he is still alive, I doubt it. She was such an interesting woman because much of her life was spent discussing reincarnation, ethics, the succession of lives, the memories which might appear, the habits which might have been formed. And I am looking forward to this one. It's chapter 9, An Assortment of Apparitions. Dennis was quite skeptical in the beginning when he met Joan, but like all her husbands, she made sure that they understood that she was finding the right answers. An Assortment of Apparitions by Joan Marshall Grant. I have never seen a traditional ghost. The amorphous, faintly luminous figure which glides through the precincts and then suddenly vanishes. My failure to do so has sometimes offended the owners of haunted houses, who have reached to my inability to see their family phantom, as they might have done had I refused to inspect their new baby. The apparitions I have encountered seemed so substantial that it was sometimes difficult to recognize that they were not solid. When I was a child, mistakes of this nature frequently got me into trouble. So I usually pretended not to see strangers until I had made sure that they were visible to everyone else. I am still apt to forget that second sight is an extension of normal vision, just as I sometimes forget that Dennis, because he is red-green colorblind, cannot share my enthusiasm for the scarlet blaze of a field of poppies. The first time I remember causing a family row by failing to realize that a visitor belonged in the category of they who should not be mentioned occurred when I was 5. My father was then a fanatical atheist and was liable to lock himself in his study if a clergyman managed to infiltrate his defences. Even a Church of England clergyman had a high rarity rating, so meeting a Roman Catholic priest who had come to visit an ailing guest was a memorable event. His cassock and four-cornered hat with a bobble on top seemed odd enough, but he had the added glory of a facial thrill of red whiskers at which I gazed entranced, while in a rich Irish brogue he told me that his name was Canon Daly and that his church was in Havant, 5 miles from my home, Seacourt on Hayling Island. I did not see him again until 2 years later, when he came into my bedroom while I was waiting for my parents to come to say good night. I recognized him immediately because his whiskers were gleaming in the light which streamed through the open doorway. He stood smiling down at me, and I knew he was pleased that I remembered him. I was trying to decide whether to address him as Canon Daly or as Father, which an Irish housemaid had told me was the correct title for a priest, when he nodded as though assuring himself that a job had been done, and walked briskly out of the room without saying anything. I had either forgotten the anti-clergic taboo or presumed it had been lifted, so I mentioned his visit at breakfast next morning. Father flung down his napkin and strode up to Mother's bedroom. He forgot to shut the door, so I heard him saying, "If you insist on the place being invaded by ecclesiastics, you will kindly inform me, so that I can keep out of their way. But I'm damned if I have them creeping about the house like black beetles." The RC is incumbent from Havant actually had the impertinence to go up to Joan's room last night. I had already had too much experience of being used as ammunition by either or both contestants during a parental argument, so I withdrew to a hideout in the shrubbery. There was no further mention of Canon Daly until the following week. Then Mother told me that she had telephoned to his church and found out that he had to return to Ireland 18 months earlier. So she had written to his new address and had now received the news that he had died on the evening he had come to see me. I wonder why he bothered to come here. We hardly knew him, I said. I should have thought he would have had far more exciting things to do now that he's dead. He came to see me, not you, said Mother. I remember telling him that death would prove to him that most of his dogmatic ideas were nonsense, and he promised to come to tell me if he discovered that I was right. Another occasion when I failed to notice that a visitor had no physical body occurred in 1916. By that stage of the war, there were usually about half a dozen wounded officers convalescing at Seacourt. I was particularly fond of one of them, a major in the Rifle Brigade, who had to lie face downwards in his spinal carriage, which I helped to push around the garden, because most of his buttocks had been blown off. Shell splinters were still working their way out of the wound, and he gave me one of them as a souvenir. He was getting much better when suddenly he had a serious relapse through developing acute sepsis. I had not been allowed to see him for several days, and then I heard that he was to have an emergency operation. This would be done in one of the bedrooms, hung with sheets dipped in disinfectant, as in those days operations often took place at home instead of the patient being moved to a hospital. I happened to be in the hall when the doctor arrived. I knew two of them, the surgeon and his partner, who was to give the anesthetic, but the third man was a stranger. I presumed he was another doctor, so was mildly surprised that instead of wearing formal black clothes like the other two, he had on a blue coat with gold buttons. As I watched him walking upstairs, the buttons glinted in the sunlight, and I noticed the crest on them. I must have mentioned him to Mother, because the next time I was allowed to visit the Major, he asked me to describe the man who had come with the two doctors who had operated on him. When I mentioned the blue coat with the crested buttons, the Major said, "I'm glad he still wears his favourite coat. It was blue like his hunt uniform, and had his crest, as you noticed, on the set of gold buttons. Very observant of you to notice that they were not brass. He was the MFH of his own pack of hounds, when we still had our family place in Yorkshire." He paused and stared out of the window. Then he said, "He has come to give me a hand on two other occasions when I was in a tricky situation. The first time was when I had blackwater fever in the Belgian Congo, and the second was when I nearly chucked in my hand after getting his packet in my backside." He smiled. "If you look in my stud box, it's in the top drawer of the dressing table, you will find one of my father's buttons. I cut it off the blue coat he was buried in, just before they closed his coffin, 15 years ago." Seeing such ghosts as the Canon and the Major's father was in no way disquieting. In fact, they were far more welcome visitors than the chattering flocks in the drawing-room, who were only too likely to demand a good-night kiss instead of becoming placated with a curtsy. But I was now becoming closely concerned with people who had so recently been killed that they had not yet realized they were safely dead. I knew that as soon as I was asleep, instead of being a child, I would again be a responsible adult who had been allotted a specific kind of war work. This work consisted of convincing men who had died in battle that they had no reason to fear dying, for this familiar transition which they had so needlessly dreaded had already taken place. Sometimes this proved to be easy, and I woke happy in the knowledge of a job well done. But if I had been sent to help someone who had allowed dogma to infect him with grotesque terrors, or who had clung to the agonies which had affected his physical body, because he thought them the only alternative to oblivion, the task of releasing him would be arduous. These experiences were as vivid as if they had occurred on the three-dimensional level of reality, so it was difficult to endure their impact on the component of my personality, which was still confined by the intellectual equipment of a young child. Sometimes the memory of sensations would persist for several minutes after I knew I was awake, and the stench of gangrene often caused me to vomit. I went through a period when I was so afraid of the terrors associated with sleep that to postpone it, I would sit on the cold parquet which surrounded my nursery carpet, or tweak out hairs, or hold my eyelids open, or drive an orange stick deeply under my nails. As everyone who has encountered similar realities knows only too well, this type of work entails so intimate a degree of identification with the other person that instead of feeling this is happening to him, one feels this is happening to me. So I would wake feeling that it was I who had been entangled in barbed wire, who had been trying to cram glistening coil back into my belly, or drowning in mud, or choking with phosgene gas. These hazards, which I now know to be an occupational risk, which must be accepted by anyone who chooses this particular profession, would have been more tolerable had I been able to talk about them. I tried to do so, but when told not to invent such horrible stories, I presumed that my description had not been sufficiently vivid to carry conviction, and so added further macabre details. This caused my parents to decide that for some unknown reason I had started to suffer from nightmares, for my mother expected the dead to approach the living circumspectly, preferably through the automatic writing of a professional medium, and my father was at that time convinced that the dead stayed dead, and that any alternative theory was mumbo-jumbo. Their attempts to solve my problem were, from my point of view, exceedingly inept. Any mention of the war was forbidden if I was present. Newspapers were whisked out of sight when I entered the room, and a united conspiracy was put into operation, which was intended to convince me that the many friends who had already been killed had all died painlessly with a bullet through the forehead. This conspiracy was so effective that I began to wonder if they had a firmer grasp of reality than I had, in which case I was undoubtedly mad. However, these speculations about my own sanity, and even at that age I had recognized that sanity is the ability to see things as they really are, lasted only for a few days, and were relieved by a collection of photographs, which aptly confirmed that the conditions I knew through true dreaming were in no way imaginary. These photographs had been brought to the house by Gloria Hancock, a cousin by marriage from North Carolina, who had taken them while working as a theater sister in casualty clearing stations. She was on her way to the United States when she intended to use them to raise money for the Red Cross. Her son Westray, who was 2 years older than I, told me about them, adding in a whisper that they were so horrific that his mother kept them locked in one of her suitcases because they would upset even the most robust grown-ups. As he knew where to find the keys, it was easy to borrow the photographs while our parents were at dinner. Certainly they were terrible, for the wounds were only covered, if covered at all, with field dressings, and the patients in no way resembled those photographs neatly arranged in hospital beds. There were men without eyes, without noses, without more than a vestige of their original faces. There were also corpses stacked like cordwood along the wall of a barn, and a much worse photograph of the same scene on the back of which Gloria had written 3 days later, after the rats. Had I had the cooperation of a sympathetic adult, I might have collected some interesting evidence of extrasensory perception during this period. But only one incident survives, and that through the confidence I suddenly felt in one of the convalescent officers, with whom I happened to be alone at breakfast. I told him that during the night I had been helping a man called MacAndrew, who had been so painlessly killed that he thought he had only been struck by a spent bullet, which could not have been even bruised his chest. I did not know the name of his regiment, but described the badge on his uniform. I also gave the slang name for the sector of the front-line trench in which he had waited before going on his last patrol into no man's land. My confidant took considerable trouble to check this information. He then wrote to my father, relating what I had told him and pointing out that it would be difficult to explain away the fact that our conversation had occurred 3 hours after a battalion of a Canadian regiment, whose badge I had accurately described, had mounted a dawn patrol from a sector whose slang name I had given, and that the only fatal casualty had been a private soldier called MacAndrew. I was not told about this letter until several years later, for my parents considered it would have encouraged me to talk about my nightmares, by which time this type of true dream seldom occurred, probably because with the cessation of mass slaughter, it was no longer necessary to use volunteers who still had immature physical bodies. The first time I engaged in a similar activity, when fully awake, was in my early 20s, while Leslie and I, together with another young couple, were driving to Austria for a summer holiday. As we wanted to see the castles of the Rhine on our outward journey, we went via Brussels and arrived at the Palace Hotel in time for a late dinner. The hotel was crowded, so we had no choice of accommodation and were allotted rooms on the 5th floor overlooking the service courtyard. I took an illogical dislike to our room, and on the pretext that it was airless, vulnerable to the smell of dustbins outside the kitchens, and had hideous wallpaper, I tried to make Leslie find us another one. Very responsibly he refused, on the grounds that we were only staying overnight and that, instead of complaining, I ought to be thankful that we had a private bathroom. After dinner the other three went off to a nightclub, but I was tired and decided to go to bed. While opening the French windows, I looked down on the pool of light streaming from the service doors on the ground floor, which seemed so far below me that it was like looking at the reflection in the bottom of a deep well. Outside the windows, which opened inwards, there was a ledge, too narrow to be termed a balcony, fenced with ornamental ironwork. Suddenly I clutched the rail, dizzy with vertigo. I had a long, hot bath, but instead of feeling relaxed, I was becoming increasingly tense. In bed I tried to read, but after about half an hour, finding I was unable to concentrate, I switched off the light. I was still very wide awake when suddenly a young man rushed out of the bathroom. Before I had time either to move or speak, he flung himself out of the window. I dived under the bedclothes so that I should not hear the dreadful thud of his body hitting the paving stones. After a couple of minutes I forced myself to sit up and listen, but I heard nothing. No agonized groans, no shrieks from the kitchen, so no one could have seen him fall. At least I must shout for someone to help him. Clutching the handrail, I peered down, but there was no corpse there, and where the corpse should have been, a waiter was carrying a crate of bottles. This was the first time I had found myself alone in a room which was being haunted by a suicide. If I prayed hard enough, someone would come to look after him, and then I should stop being so terrified. I prayed until the sweat ran down my forehead, and then got back into bed and tried to sleep. But I still had my eyes open when the same dreadful sequence was repeated. This time I made myself listen, but I heard nothing, so I was unable to learn whether he had lingered screaming or died instantly. The obvious thing to do would have been to to get dressed and go for a walk, or try to find the others, or sit in a bar, but this did not occur to me. Praying hadn't helped the poor man, so freeing him from the despair in which he was trapped was a job that I was expected to do. My heart was pounding so hard that it was difficult to think clearly. I had freed many newly dead people while I was asleep, but I had been able to do so because I had managed not to be affected by their fear. I could feel his panic soaking into me like ink into blotting paper. I should have to free what he was feeling before I could get close enough to him to be of any real help. But then his fear might be stronger than my dwindling courage. My body might follow his on that horrific plunge. At least I could guard against this danger by pulling the chest of drawers across the window, so that whatever happened I could not fall out. When this barrier was in place I felt a little braver, but I could only just hold back the waves of fear, which I knew would get much more insistent when I attained the necessary degree of identification. Unless someone is with me, to whom I can describe my feelings while they are occurring, I can seldom remember more than a blurred outline of what I experienced during this very difficult type of level shift. But I know that I shared that man's fall. As he leaned over the balustrade, he suddenly tried to regain his balance, but it was too late. He tried to thrust out his arms to break his fall. He seemed to fall so slowly. Then he realized he would be terribly injured and tried to pull back his arms so as to land on his head. He felt no pain, only a grinding thud, and then he was back in the bathroom and running towards the window again, over and over again, over and over again. I found myself standing with my hands stretched upwards, saying aloud, "Your fear has entered into me, and you are free. Your fear has entered into me, and you are free." The fear, both his and mine, began to release itself in a flood of tears and sobbing so violent that it bordered on hysteria. Within half an hour I would have been perfectly normal again. Unfortunately for Leslie, he came back when I was in the full spate of the reaction. He was accused of being a monster who had deliberately left his wife to deal with a suicide. It was no thanks to him that I had not broken my neck. The other couple, acutely embarrassed, scuttled off to their room without further along the corridor. Leslie tried to pacify me by saying that I had only had a nightmare. He apologized for this next morning after discovering from the manager that the previous occupant of our room had thrown himself from the window 5 days earlier. And I stopped this here. This is Joan. This is the first reading of chapter 9.